Chapter 1. The Lamp in the Fog. It was on a damp and mist-ridden morning in the early November when the case that would later confound Scotland Yard and stir Holmes from his habitual ennui first reached our door. I, Dr. John Watson, had returned from an early stroll along Marylebone Road, my boots caked in soot from the persistent fog that clung to London like a damp blanket. The gas lamps hissed wearily along Baker Street, their yellow glow barely penetrating the smog. Inside 221B, Holmes sat motionless in his chair, a Persian slipper resting on the mantel above him, stuffed with tobacco. He had not spoken since my return, but I could tell from the narrowed gleam of his eyes and the untouched breakfast tray that his mind had settled on some private conundrum. It was then that Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing not a tray this time, but a look of hesitant alarm. "There's a gentleman downstairs, sir," she said, "but he's not a gentleman in the ordinary sense. Inspector Gregson of the Yard. Says it's a matter of some urgency." Holmes raised a brow and turned slowly. "Gregson, you say? The better of the Yard men, though that's faint praise. Show him up, Mrs. Hudson, and quickly. I do so dislike being kept from a mystery." Moments later, Inspector Tobias Gregson stepped through our sitting-room door, his coat flecked with raindrops and his hat crushed in his hand. He looked tired, more than usual, and though Gregson was not given to dramatics, he sank heavily into a chair opposite Holmes and exhaled a breath as thick as the fog outside. "It's an odd one, Holmes. A blasted strange one." Holmes's steepled fingers did not move. "Isn't that what you said the last time, when it turned out to be a disgruntled postman and a misplaced will?" Gregson smiled weakly. "This one's different. I'd not have come if it weren't." "Then by all means," Holmes said with a wave of his hand. "Begin." Gregson reached into his coat and withdrew a folded telegram, which he passed to Holmes. I leaned over as Holmes opened it with a flick of his long fingers. "Murder at Dunbridge Manor. Study locked from inside. No forced entry. Lampshade blinked in Morse before death. Impossible scene. Please assist. Constable Ridley. Dunbridge Manor," Holmes murmured. "That's Surrey, is it not?" "Aye," said Gregson. "A retired admiral named Penrose. Found dead in his study last night. Stabbed through the heart. The room was locked from within, windows latched. No sign of struggle. What's more, the household staff swears that just before the admiral was discovered, the gas lamp on his desk blinked, deliberately, in a sequence. Morse code, apparently. The message spelled just one word." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And that word was?" Gregson hesitated. "Help." A silence settled over the room like dust. "Well," Holmes said finally, standing with sudden energy, "that certainly adds flavor. A locked room murder is always a rare delicacy, but a lamp blinking in Morse before a man's death, that is positively gastronomic." I frowned. "But surely a flickering lamp." "No, Watson," Holmes said, donning his coat in a smooth movement. "This was not a faulty pipe or a gust of wind. Morse is deliberate. Someone or something was sending a message moments before Admiral Penrose met his end. Come, the game is afoot." Gregson stood as well. "A carriage is waiting downstairs. We'll reach Surrey before midday." Holmes paused at the door and turned back to glance once more at the telegram. Locked from the inside. A final message from a flickering lamp and a dead naval officer. Curious, curious indeed. And with that, we descended the stairs of 221B and into the heart of what would become one of the most baffling cases of Holmes's career, a case where truth flickered in and out of shadow, and where even the light itself spoke in desperate code. Chapter 2. The Man from the Sea. We had not yet passed the county boundary when Holmes lit his second cigarette and turned his gaze away from the mist-frosted window of the carriage to address me. "There is something peculiarly maritime about this case," he said without preamble. "How so?" I asked, tugging my coat tighter. The wind whistled through the window seams as the horses trudged steadily through the grey sludge of the road. Aside from Admiral Penrose's profession, of course. Precisely because of his profession, Watson, naval men carry with them the habits of their command long after they are removed from sea. Their domestic life tends toward the rigid. Their routines are exact. If Penrose's final moments deviated in any way from those patterns, the reason is likely significant. I nodded, though I felt a familiar sensation creeping into my chest. The sensation that I was already a step behind Holmes and the game had only just begun. Holmes, who must have noted the flicker of doubt in my expression, smiled faintly. "Do not look so glum, my dear fellow. You are invaluable in precisely these moments. Your common sense anchors me, lest I float too far into theory." "Then tell me, Holmes," I said, "what do you make of the lamp?" He exhaled a thin stream of smoke toward the carriage ceiling. "An extraordinary detail, if the account is accurate, and I stress if. Then we are dealing with either a dying message or a deliberate warning sent by someone else. And if the message was 'help,' the urgency is clear. The real question is who sent it, and why." "Could it have been the Admiral himself?" I offered. "In his final moments?" Holmes shook his head. "You must recall how Morse code is signaled, Watson. It requires timing, rhythm. Dot, dash, pause. To flicker a gas lamp in such a fashion, under duress and near death, would be nothing short of miraculous. No. Either someone else was in the room and sent the message, or they were outside the room and manipulated the light remotely. Both are devilishly improbable." I sat in silence, pondering that bleak conundrum as the road curved toward the countryside. The landscape had turned bleak and desolate, the trees half naked, the sky a permanent slate gray. It seemed a fitting mood for murder. "Tell me what you know of the Admiral," Holmes said at last. "From the newspapers, perhaps." "Only that he retired 10 years ago after a distinguished career," I replied. "He commanded the HMS Monarch in the Baltic, if I remember correctly. Decorated, respected. Married, though his wife died some years back. Lived at Dunbridge Manor with a modest staff. Children? One daughter, I believe. Rosamond. No mention of a son." Holmes tapped his long fingers against the carriage door. A daughter is often an emotional lever in these cases, especially if young and impressionable. "She would be near 30 by now," I said, recalling a society notice. "I believe she was once engaged to a Captain Harcourt. Naval as well. Interesting. A military mind paired with a military heart. Perhaps too alike to last." We were still ruminating on that thought when the carriage crested a small rise, and Dunbridge Manor came into view. It was a stout, grim-faced house of dark brick and shuttered windows, surrounded by barren gardens and crooked hedges. Fog clung to its edges, softening the outline of its gables and chimneys like a house half dissolved into the moor. As we approached, I noted the presence of 2 constables standing outside the wrought iron gate, their figures ghost-like in the swirling mist. A third man, tall, lean and cloaked, awaited us at the main entrance. "That will be Constable Ridley," Gregson muttered. "He's the one who first called it in." The moment we alighted from the carriage, Ridley stepped forward and saluted. "Inspector, Mr. Holmes, Doctor." "Your message was brief," Holmes said, already scanning the house with restless eyes. "Let us not waste time. Lead us to the scene." "Of course, sir. The body's been moved to the drawing room, but we've left the study untouched, just as we found it." "Excellent," Holmes replied. "And the witnesses?" "4 in total, sir. The daughter, Miss Rosamond Penrose, the butler, Mr. Keating, a maid named Clara, and the cook, Mrs. Prowse. All accounted for, and none left the property since the incident." Holmes gave a small nod and gestured toward the entrance. "Then let us begin where the Admiral's life ended." We stepped through the double doors into the Manor's main hall. The interior was just as austere as its exterior. Naval paintings lined the walls, and a gleaming brass telescope stood beside the fireplace, pointed toward a frosted window. The house exuded order, discipline, and a subtle chill. "The study is this way," said Ridley, leading us down a short corridor lined with bookshelves and faded nautical maps. He stopped before a stout wooden door, its brass handle polished to a dull shine. "The door was locked from the inside," he said, "and we had to break it to get in. The window was also latched from within. No other means of entry." Holmes crouched low, examining the threshold, the hinges, and the lock mechanism without opening the door just yet. "No signs of tampering," he murmured. "And the key?" "In the Admiral's pocket, sir, along with his watch and spectacles. Nothing appears stolen." Holmes stood. "Very well. Doctor, prepare yourself. This may be unpleasant." The study was precisely as Ridley described, neat, compact, and with every item in place, save for a single overturned chair. The gas lamp on the desk was unlit, its glass shade slightly ajar. A blood stain marred the rug, though the body itself had been removed. Papers lay in ordered piles. A nautical almanac sat open on the desk, and above all, there was a strange stillness in the room, as if the space were holding its breath. Holmes moved slowly through it, his fingers brushing the lamp, the desk's edge, the shuttered window. Then he stopped, completely, as if listening. "What is it?" I asked quietly. He raised a finger. "The ticking. Do you hear it?" I strained to listen, and there it was, a faint, rhythmic ticking from beneath the floorboards. Not a clock, too uneven, too coded. Holmes crouched and pressed his ear to the floor. "Morse," he whispered. And in that moment the cold grew sharper, the silence deeper, because whatever had flickered that lamp was still sending signals. Chapter 3. The message beneath the floor. Holmes remained crouched for a full minute, unmoving, with his ear pressed to the hardwood floor of the late Admiral Penrose's study. The rhythmic ticking, a fragile, almost imperceptible series of faint knocks, continued beneath him like a secret heartbeat. I strained to hear it again, but to my ears it sounded like no more than the house settling. Then, without warning, it stopped. Holmes slowly rose, brushing the dust from his trousers. He turned to me, his eyes alight with something between curiosity and calculation. "It ceased the moment you shifted, Watson. Are you suggesting I frightened it off?" "Not you, no. Your movement, however subtle, might have disrupted some mechanism. A mechanical relay, perhaps. Or, more intriguingly." He looked around the room, gaze sweeping every inch of shadow. A human ear listening from the other side. I felt a chill at that thought, and instinctively looked down, as though I might see the very floorboards blink. Gregson had entered the room behind us, but he had not heard the sound, and now stood looking between us with growing impatience. "I must confess, Holmes, I'm at sea here. A man stabbed in a locked room, a blinking lamp, and now ghosts in the floor." Holmes gave a dry smile. "There are no ghosts, Inspector. Only misdirection and machinery." He gestured toward the overturned chair near the desk. "Note the position of the chair. Too far from the body's reported position to be a struggle. It was knocked over, yes, but not in panic. More likely it was placed in that position deliberately. Watson, how would a man stabbed through the heart fall?" "Straightforward. He would collapse either forward or backward, depending on the angle of the blow." "Precisely. And yet the Admiral was found lying almost on his side, feet tucked beneath him, one arm extended toward the lamp. That's a curious position to die in, wouldn't you say?" I nodded slowly. "As if he were reaching for something, or trying to send something." Holmes moved now with renewed urgency, scanning the perimeter of the room. He stopped beside the large bookcase to the right of the fireplace and withdrew a magnifying lens from his coat. "Dust," he murmured, pointing to a thin line at the base. "Disrupted recently. Someone has moved this." With a grunt of effort, he pressed against the frame and the heavy bookcase inched back, revealing a narrow gap in the wooden paneling. He knelt and tapped the wall. A hollow sound responded. "There's a crawl space," he announced, "running beneath the floorboards." Gregson stepped forward. "Should we open it up?" Holmes shook his head. "Not yet. Let us first see the scene as it was when the crime occurred. To tear its secrets too early is to lose their shape." He returned to the desk and examined the gas lamp. "Notice anything peculiar about the mechanism, Watson?" I leaned closer. "The mantle is intact, though the shade has been nudged. But wait." I crouched beside him. "There's something at the base. A fine thread." Holmes carefully extracted it using a small pair of tweezers. A slender copper wire, nearly invisible to the naked eye, ran from the gas knob and disappeared beneath the desk. Holmes traced its path to a small, disguised notch in the wood, where it vanished into the floor. "Well, well," he whispered. "That settles it." The lamp was rigged to flicker on command. I looked at him in astonishment. "Are you saying someone was beneath the floor during the murder?" "Either beneath or controlling it from an adjoining space. This was no accident. This message, 'Help,' was meant to be seen, but the sender did not intend to reveal themselves." And the Admiral. "Whether he saw the message or not, we do not yet know. What is certain is that the killer staged the scene to present a locked room puzzle, when in fact the room was never truly sealed." He stood, brushing his hands. "Now let us interview the household. I wish to know who last saw Admiral Penrose alive and, more importantly, who would have known about this crawl space." Gregson motioned toward the hall. "They're waiting in the parlor." We followed him down the corridor, our steps muffled by the thick rugs that lined the floor. As we entered the parlor, 4 figures rose from their seats. At once, my gaze was drawn to a woman of striking poise and quiet sadness. She was tall, with dark auburn hair drawn into a modest bun, and her eyes, grey and watchful, met Holmes's with no sign of fear. "Miss Rosamond Penrose?" Holmes asked. "Yes," she said. Her voice was calm, steady. "You must be Mr. Holmes. They told me you would come." Holmes inclined his head. "My condolences, Miss Penrose. I regret the circumstances." She offered a faint smile. "So do I. But if anyone can make sense of it—" Holmes turned to the others. "And the staff?" The butler stepped forward first, a gaunt man of 60 with pale skin and a face like a forgotten ledger. "Keating, sir. I've served the Admiral these past 17 years. The maid, Clara, was a plain girl of perhaps 20 with nervous eyes and reddened hands. She gave a curtsy and murmured a greeting. The cook, Mrs. Prowse, remained seated, her arms crossed over a vast floral apron. Holmes paced slowly before them. "I will speak to each of you individually. For now, a simple question. Who was the last to see the Admiral alive?" Miss Penrose answered first. "I brought him his tea around 8. He was in his study, writing letters. He said he was expecting no visitors and wished not to be disturbed." Keating nodded. "I locked up the rear doors shortly before 9. All windows were secure. At 10, Clara knocked with his nightly paper. When he didn't respond, we assumed he had gone to bed." Clara spoke up. "But he hadn't. Not until we saw the lamp flickering through the window, like it was blinking. I ran to tell Miss Rosamond. She fetched Keating, and when he forced the door—" Her voice caught, and she stopped. Holmes' eyes narrowed. "You say the lamp was visible from outside?" Clara nodded. "Only faintly. Through the lower pane. It blinked 3 or 4 times. I was certain it spelled something." "Interesting," Holmes said quietly. "And did anyone besides the Admiral have reason to access the crawl space beneath the floorboards?" Keating looked puzzled. "Crawl space?" I didn't know there was one. Holmes turned to Miss Penrose. She hesitated, then spoke. I remember, as a child, there was a story about a smuggler's tunnel beneath the manor. My father used to mention it in jest. I assumed it was only that, a story. Holmes smiled thinly, as do most who walk above secrets. He looked at Gregson. I want the trap door to that crawl space uncovered. If someone used it during the murder, we may still find evidence of their passage. And Watson, yes? Keep your revolver handy. I sense the killer is not yet finished. Chapter 4. Beneath polite silence. The study had been sealed off with twine, and a constable now stood guard outside the door. Holmes, meanwhile, had taken up temporary residence in the Admiral's drawing room, where the hearth hissed softly and shadows danced along the carved paneling. The rest of us gathered at his request, summoned one by one for closer examination. Miss Rosamond Penrose sat nearest the fire, her face composed but pale. She clutched a lace handkerchief in one hand, though I noted it remained dry. Keating stood stiffly by the door, his hands clasped behind his back as though attending to invisible guests. The maid Clara sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes darting like a mouse cornered by a cat. And finally, Mrs. Prowse loomed by the sideboard, arms folded, lips pressed thin. Holmes, seated with one leg crossed over the other, spoke with the calm rhythm of a man playing a familiar tune. I wish to understand the shape of this household, he began, what the Admiral's routines were, who crossed his path, and how harmony here might have been disturbed. Rosamond responded first. There was no disharmony, Mr. Holmes. My father was strict but fair, a man of great discipline. Even in retirement he kept to his naval hours. Tea at 8, correspondence until 10, rest by past. Holmes gave a faint nod. And his temperament? She hesitated. Private, stern, but never cruel. Did he fear anyone, or suspect he was in danger? No, she said quietly. But he had grown distant these past weeks, especially after receiving a parcel 2 Mondays ago. He locked it in his desk and refused to speak of it. Holmes's brow lifted. A parcel? Yes, I brought it in myself. No return address. It unsettled him. Interesting. And the staff? Did any of you witness changes in the Admiral's behavior following this delivery? Keating responded with crisp certainty. He became more withdrawn, short-tempered. He began locking the study door more frequently. Did you know the combination to the desk drawer? No, sir. Holmes turned his gaze toward Clara. Miss Clara, did you ever enter the study without permission? She flinched. No, sir. Never. He didn't like people touching his papers, not even Miss Rosamond. But you saw the flickering lamp? Yes, I saw it from the courtyard. It blinked 4 or 5 times. I didn't understand it, but it gave me a fright, like the house itself was trying to speak. Holmes smiled faintly at her wording, but said nothing. Instead, he looked to Mrs. Prowse. And you, madam? The cook huffed. The Admiral didn't concern himself with the kitchen. He ate what I made and rarely offered thanks or complaint. That was our understanding. Was there any conflict between you? No, sir. We kept to our own paths. Holmes stood and began to pace the room. Let us consider what we know. The Admiral is found dead in a locked room, apparently having sent or received a message in Morse. A crawl space exists beneath the study, known only to a few, perhaps forgotten by most. A mysterious parcel arrived 2 weeks prior, after which the Admiral's behavior changed, and somewhere in this house, someone is lying. The room fell still. Holmes turned to Rosamond. May I ask, Miss Penrose, your relationship with Captain Harcourt? She blinked. We were once engaged, but not now. No, it was broken off 3 years ago. Why? Her jaw stiffened. Because he lied. About debts, about his conduct. My father intervened and ended it. Have you seen him recently? No, she said too quickly. Then, after a breath, "Yes. He called last month. He wanted to speak with my father. I told him it wasn't possible." "Did the Admiral know of this?" "I don't know," she said softly. "Perhaps." Holmes looked toward Gregson, who had been silent until now. "We shall need to locate Harcourt. Quietly. There is more in this broken engagement than wounded pride." Gregson gave a curt nod and stepped out to make arrangements. Holmes then gestured for Keating to approach. "When you locked up the house the night of the murder, did you inspect all the windows yourself?" "Yes, sir, as I do every night." "Did you hear any unusual sounds? Movement beneath the floor?" Keating's brow furrowed. "No, sir, though I did think I heard the Admiral speaking to someone just before 10. It was muffled. I assumed he was dictating a letter." "Did you hear a response?" "No, sir. Just his voice." Holmes folded his arms. "Strange. He was supposedly alone in the room. The door was locked, and yet you heard him speaking." Keating looked visibly unsettled. Holmes turned again to Clara. "Miss Clara, when you knocked to deliver the paper, what time was that?" "Just after 10, maybe 10:05. "No answer. No sound." "None, sir." "And when you saw the lamp flicker, was that before or after the knock?" "After," she whispered. "I'd just left the hallway and was walking toward the garden window." Holmes nodded, deep in thought. "I will need to see the parcel," he said to Rosamond. She looked surprised. "But I told you, he locked it away. I don't know where." Holmes gave her a long, unreadable look. "Then we must find the key." At that moment, a constable entered the drawing room. "Begging your pardon, sir," he said to Gregson, "but we've located the entrance to the crawl space. It's through a trap door in the wine cellar, just below the study." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Excellent. Have it opened. But do not enter yet. I want to see it first." As the constable left, Holmes turned back to us, his tone more solemn. "Ladies and gentlemen, you may return to your quarters. I must now investigate the hollow beneath this house." Rosamond rose slowly, her eyes on Holmes. "Do you think the killer was under the floor while my father died?" Holmes tilted his head slightly. "Perhaps. Or perhaps they had already left." And the floor simply whispered the truth they forgot to silence. She turned pale and left the room. As the household dispersed, Holmes turned to me. "There is deceit here, Watson, but it is not crude. It is calculated. Each of them wears a mask. Do you believe one of them is the killer?" He nodded. "I believe all of them are hiding something. But only one manipulated a lamp to speak in code, and only one knew what it was saying." Chapter 5. A man worth arresting. The entrance to the crawl space lay hidden beneath a warped floorboard in the wine cellar, a narrow, dust-choked corridor barely high enough for Holmes to stand crouched. Lantern in hand, he ducked into the shadows, leaving Gregson and me above with the constable who had uncovered the trap door. The cellar was cold and damp. Cobwebs quivered in unseen drafts. The air smelled of mildew and aged oak, and the only sound was the distant drip of condensation off rusted pipes. Holmes's voice drifted up faintly. "It runs the length of the study above. Reinforced beams, possibly original to the foundation. Watson, join me, if you will. I'll need your light." I descended the old wooden steps, ducking beneath a low archway as I passed into the space below the house. Holmes was crouched on the ground, inspecting a section of the crawl space floor where the dust had been disturbed. "Look here," he said, gesturing with his cane. "Someone has been here. Recently." I knelt beside him. The floor, layered with decades of dust, bore a distinct impression. A narrow rut like that of a boot sole, partially smeared as though the foot had pivoted. Nearby, scratches lined the underside of one floorboard above. There was also something else, faint scuff marks, almost like clawing. Holmes raised the lantern, illuminating a small pulley device affixed to a beam and a fine copper wire that extended upward through a drilled hole in the floor. The wire was taut, leading directly toward the study. A crude mechanism, Holmes murmured, but effective. It would allow someone to flick the gas lamp on and off from beneath by remote pressure. It confirms the message was not accidental. I frowned. But why go through the trouble of sending a message only to commit a murder moments later? That, Watson, is precisely the paradox that intrigues me. We returned above ground, brushing dust from our coats. Gregson was pacing in the drawing room, his boots leaving damp tracks on the rug. "I've sent a man to question Captain Harcourt," he said. "Turns out he's in London, barely 10 miles from here." Holmes gave no outward sign of interest, but I could tell from the slight shift in his posture that the name still held weight. Gregson continued, "And there's more. It seems our dear Clara may not be quite the innocent she pretends to be." "How so?" "Some digging by the local constable turned up her record. She worked in Brighton 2 years ago for a solicitor. Left abruptly after a sum of money went missing, never formally charged, but suspicion followed her. She changed her surname after that. Real name's Clara Tomlin, not Clara Wells." Holmes smiled faintly. An assumed identity. Curious. And she was among the first to see the flickering lamp. Exactly. She claims she saw the Morse code, but what if she knew to look for it? What if she was part of it? You're suggesting she staged it, or helped someone who did. Holmes tapped his fingertips together. No. Clara may be hiding something, but not murder. She lacks the cunning. Fear, yes. Guilt, perhaps, but not control. Gregson scoffed. "You always say that. And yet it's always the one least suspected." Holmes turned away from him, walking to the study window and gazing through the fogged glass. "And what about Rosamond Penrose?" "She has motive," Gregson said. "A father who ended her engagement. Perhaps the will favored charities over his only child. Have we found the will?" "Not yet," I said. "Holmes believes it's in the locked desk drawer." "We'll force it open then." "No," Holmes said sharply, turning back. "We do nothing that may destroy the shape of the truth. This crime was constructed carefully, like a house of cards. Knock down one piece too soon, and the structure collapses." He looked to Gregson. "Clara is not our killer, but she may know who is." "Bring her in. I'll speak with her privately." A short time later, Clara sat before Holmes, wringing her hands in her lap. Her face was paler than before, and her eyes darted nervously about the room. "Miss Tomlin," Holmes began softly, "or shall I say, Miss Wells, I'm not concerned with the money in Brighton, nor the solicitor's missing account books, but I am concerned with truth. You've seen death now. That should be enough to shake loose whatever secrets you hold." "I didn't kill him," she said instantly. "I believe you," Holmes replied. "But I heard things. In the walls. For weeks. I thought I was imagining it. Rats, maybe. But after the parcel came, it got worse. I'd pass the study and hear tapping. And twice, I swear to God, Mr. Holmes, I heard whispering beneath the floor." Holmes leaned forward. "What did it say?" "I couldn't tell. Just low voices. And last week I saw a man in the garden. At night. He was standing near the hedge and looking at the study window. When I called out, he ran." "Describe him." "Tall, wearing a long coat. I thought it might be Captain Harcourt, but I wasn't sure." Holmes nodded once. "That's enough, Clara. You may go." As she left, Gregson let out a low whistle. "A man in the garden, the whispering, it's all pointing to Harcourt." Holmes was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to us with sudden decisiveness. "No, it's too obvious. Harcourt is our red herring, deliberately cast into the waters to attract suspicion. You don't think he did it?" "I think he was lured here. Just as the lamp was meant to be seen, Harcourt was meant to be suspected. Whoever engineered this crime wanted someone for the police to chase. Harcourt is the man worth arresting because he is meant to be arrested. Gregson bristled. Then what do you suggest we do? We let the play continue, Holmes said. Let the killer believe their illusion remains intact. The moment they think their plan has succeeded, that is when they'll strike again. Gregson hesitated. Strike again? Yes, Holmes said darkly. This isn't over. This was never about Admiral Penrose alone. There is more at stake here, and the second act has yet to begin. He turned to me, eyes alight. Watson, fetch your revolver. Tonight, we wait beneath the floor. Chapter 6. Beneath the Silence. The wind sighed mournfully through the gutters of Dunbridge Manor as night fell, wrapping the estate in a chill that seemed to seep through stone and skin alike. Fog clung to the hedgerows and blurred the lanterns lining the gravel walk. Within the manor, all was still, except beneath it. Holmes and I sat crouched in the crawl space beneath the Admiral's study, cloaked in silence and dust. Above us, the boards creaked gently with the occasional shift of the old house settling. We had brought only a lantern, dimmed now to near darkness, and a field notebook Holmes used to scribble occasional thoughts in the low flicker of light. If I am correct, Holmes whispered, the killer will return to this space before dawn. And if you're wrong, I asked, keeping my revolver close. Then we shall spend the night with the spiders and learn nothing. But even that, Watson, is a kind of answer. We waited. The hours crawled by in heavy quiet. At one point I dozed off against a joist, only to be nudged awake by Holmes's hand upon my sleeve. He pointed upward. Soft footsteps above us. Measured, deliberate. The clock in the hallway struck 2. The steps did not belong to any housemaid or constable. These were careful, purposeful movements, shifting across the study floor. Then came a pause, and the unmistakable sound of something being dragged. Holmes motioned for me to still myself. He extinguished the lantern completely, plunging us into total blackness. Above, the dragging stopped. We heard 3 quick knocks, a code tapped against the floorboards. Then silence, a faint metallic click. Then a single knock, a pause, 2 short knocks, a pause, 1 long. Holmes's breath caught. Morse, he whispered, but reversed, its response code. Someone down here used to signal someone up there. We heard retreating footsteps. Quicker now. Then a door creaked and closed. Whoever it was had left. Holmes waited a full minute before relighting the lantern and rising. We must see what they came for. Back above ground, we quietly ascended to the study. The constable posted at the door had not seen or heard anyone. Holmes unlocked the study using the same skeleton key Gregson had employed earlier and stepped inside. The room smelled faintly of dust and old oil. Everything looked as we'd left it, except for one thing. The Admiral's desk had been opened. I left this drawer locked, Holmes murmured. Inside the compartment, documents lay in disarray, letters, maps, an ivory-handled dagger, and a brown paper envelope that had been torn open. Holmes removed it delicately and examined the remnants. This was the parcel Miss Penrose mentioned. It was here all along, hidden until tonight. He reached inside and withdrew the contents, a single sheet of parchment and a small brass medallion on a fraying ribbon. The parchment bore just 5 words, scrawled in elegant, slanted hand. I never forgot Malta. C. Holmes stared at the page for a long moment, as if expecting it to explain itself. The ink is recent, perhaps no more than a fortnight old. And this, he held up the medallion, is a naval commendation, Royal Navy, Mediterranean Command. Late 1860s. I frowned. Malta? That's where Penrose served during the blockade. But what does it mean? Holmes didn't answer. He was fixated now on the parchment's edge, where a faint watermark could be seen under the lantern. "Barrow and Sons," he murmured. "Stationers, Whitechapel." Gregson entered at that moment, drawn by the reopened door. His eyes went straight to the disturbed drawer. "Something missing?" "No," Holmes replied. "Something left behind. Our midnight visitor wasn't here to steal. They were looking for something they'd left. Perhaps proof of an earlier visit." He handed Gregson the note. "Find out who purchased Barrow and Sons parchment paper in the last 3 weeks. Ask for anyone requesting foreign stationery or naval seals." Gregson nodded and left with the note. Holmes turned to me. "The message is personal. I never forgot Malta. A shared history between the Admiral and this mysterious sea. But note the subtle threat, never forgot, implies a wrong done, a debt, possibly betrayal. And the medallion, returned not as tribute, but as reminder. A symbol of the past, perhaps one the Admiral buried and thought lost." He paused. Whoever sent this wanted the Admiral to know he had not escaped the past, and perhaps that justice was coming. We searched the desk further, but found nothing else of interest. Holmes then examined the broken drawer's lock and found scratches around the keyhole. "Picked," he muttered, "and not well. Our intruder tonight is no professional thief." Back in the drawing room, Holmes gathered the household again, this time quietly, with Gregson's help, waking them one by one. He did not yet accuse, but he watched each face carefully as he revealed the note from Malta and the medallion. Rosamond went pale. He never spoke of Malta, only that he left it behind for good. Clara looked confused. Keating, however, froze for a half-second too long. "You recognize it," Holmes said. "No," Keating replied. "Only that I saw the Admiral polishing that medal once, many years ago. He kept it in a glass case until his wife passed. And after, I never saw it again. Until now," Holmes said. Mrs. Prowse stepped forward suddenly. "Excuse me, but what if this C is Captain Harcourt? His first name is Charles, isn't it?" Holmes's brow lifted slightly. "An excellent suggestion, Mrs. Prowse, and exactly the one the killer wants us to make." She blinked. "You mean it isn't him?" "Oh, I didn't say that," Holmes said mildly. "Only that he may have been chosen as a shadow for someone else." He dismissed the group after that, much to their confusion and mild resentment. As they dispersed, I turned to Holmes. "What is it you saw in Keating's reaction?" "Guilt, but not over murder. Something subtler. Knowledge. He knew about the medal, yes, but more importantly, he knew it was missing before I said it had been stolen." "Then he's involved?" "Possibly. Or he's protecting someone." Holmes rubbed his chin. "We're circling closer now, Watson. The message, the medal, the crawl space, it's all converging. But toward whom?" He looked at me gravely. "We'll know soon enough. But tonight, the house blinked twice. Once in fear, and once in memory. Someone still lives here who remembers Malta." Chapter 7. Shadows of a Second Crime. Morning broke reluctantly over Dunbridge Manor, the sun smothered beneath a thick quilt of fog that refused to lift. The old house looked less a noble estate and more a place marked by time, secrets, and restless sleep. Even the birds seemed hesitant to sing. Holmes had not slept. He paced the length of the study shortly after dawn, brows knitted, fingers clasped behind his back in that deliberate gait that always signaled heavy deduction. I, meanwhile, nursed a tepid cup of tea in the drawing-room and watched the man's mind turn like clockwork gears beneath his quiet facade. "Watson," he called, "do come." I joined him in the study, where he gestured to the scattered contents of the Admiral's desk, the medal, the Malta note, the flickering lamp's copper wire. "We've missed something," he said abruptly. "Not a detail of the crime, but of its shape. Every locked room mystery seeks to confound the eye. But this one, Watson, does more. It attempts to control perception itself. The blinking lamp was never meant for the Admiral. It was staged, perhaps well after he was dead. I stiffened. But we heard the tapping beneath the floor, the Morse. I said someone returned to manipulate the scene, Holmes replied, and I believe that someone was not the killer, but an accomplice, trying to keep the illusion intact. At that moment, a heavy knock echoed through the house. Moments later, Constable Merrin appeared at the study door, visibly rattled. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Holmes, but there's, well, another body." Holmes turned sharply. "Where?" "In the root cellar, under the western wing. Mrs. Prowse found it this morning. Said she went down to retrieve vinegar and saw someone lying there, arms crossed over his chest like a saint, sir." We wasted no time. Moments later, we were standing in the earthy coolness of the root cellar, a low bricked room thick with the scent of old vegetables and damp burlap. In one corner, between two broken crates, lay the body of a man. He was young, mid-30s perhaps, with soot-dark hair and a faint beard. His clothes were plain and worn, brown trousers, an old woolen coat, boots muddied with garden soil. His hands had been placed neatly over his chest, palms together, and his throat bore a narrow purple line. "Strangled," I said, kneeling to examine the wound. "Cleanly and with precision," Holmes agreed. "A thin cord, possibly piano wire. Note the lack of struggle. He was either taken by surprise or subdued first." Gregson had arrived and now stood beside us, aghast. "Who the devil is he?" "I don't know," Holmes murmured, "but I believe he is our accomplice, or at least someone who knew the accomplice." He crouched beside the corpse, examining the man's boots. Same mud as the garden. He was outside during the night, possibly the one Clara saw last week. Gregson turned to the constable. "Search the man's pockets." Merrin complied and soon handed over a crumpled envelope. Holmes took it carefully. Inside was a torn scrap of paper bearing a half-completed message in Morse, DONOT. Holmes read it aloud. "Do not." "What?" I said. "Whatever he intended to warn against," Holmes murmured. "He never finished. Someone silenced him before he could." Gregson scowled. "So now we've two victims. The Admiral and this man. Unknown, possibly a common criminal." "Not a common one," Holmes corrected. "His hands are clean save for the nails. Slight calluses, ink stains. Not a laborer. Perhaps a clerk, or a code breaker." "A code breaker?" Holmes rose slowly. "Yes, or someone adept in Morse, someone whose skill was used, then discarded." He turned toward me. "We must speak to Miss Penrose again." Back in the parlor, Rosamond sat in a window seat, sunlight falling through the fog beyond. Her expression was unreadable, but she accepted Holmes's presence without protest. "Miss Penrose," Holmes said gently. Did your father ever receive visits from a man in his 30s? Dark hair, modest clothing?" Her eyes narrowed slightly. "A few months ago, there was someone. He came twice. My father didn't let him in. Spoke to him through the door. I heard the name once. Lyle? Kyle? Do you remember anything else? He seemed desperate, angry even, but my father refused him." Holmes paced the length of the room. "And the parcel. You said you brought it to your father. Are you sure it came anonymously?" "Yes," she said. "No return name. No sender address. But the envelope was not posted. There was no stamp. It was hand-delivered." Her brow furrowed. "Now that you say it." Holmes stopped. "So someone placed it on the doorstep. That suggests proximity. Someone close enough to the estate to leave a message unnoticed." He paused. "Miss Penrose, you said your father never spoke of Malta. But did you know why he left the service?" She hesitated. "Only that he retired early. A scandal, perhaps." "There were whispers." "Whispers," Holmes echoed. "Indeed. He excused himself then and returned to the study. As soon as we were alone, he retrieved the Malta note once more and stared at it for a long time. "What is it, Holmes?" I asked. "The ink," he said softly. "When we first found the note, I said it was recent, but I was wrong. Look closely at the edges, Watson. Faint feathering. It's older than 2 weeks. Years, even. The parchment was reused. The message copied. Copied. But by whom? By someone with access to the original. Someone trying to recreate the past." He held the medallion up to the light. Then, without a word, he walked briskly from the study and down the hall to the servants' wing. Keating opened his door, sleepy-eyed and startled. Holmes held the medal out. "Tell me again. You said you saw this years ago. Are you sure?" Keating nodded. "I polished it myself once. The Admiral showed it to me, asked me to keep it locked in the desk." Holmes leaned in. "And did you ever see him take it out again?" "No," Keating replied. "Not once. Not until now." Holmes's voice dropped to a whisper. "Then how, Keating, did you recognize it before I showed it to you?" The butler's face froze. I must have remembered." "No," Holmes said softly. "You didn't remember it. You handled it. Recently." Keating backed away, eyes wide. Holmes advanced slowly. "You forged the message, didn't you? Recreated the past to frighten the Admiral. You were the accomplice. But you didn't kill him. That was someone else." "I don't," Holmes raised a hand. "Save your lies. You staged the lamp. You tapped the code. But someone else wanted him dead." He turned toward me. "Watson, we've been chasing ghosts. But now, at last, we have a name for the shadow." Chapter 8. The trap laid in conversation. Keating had folded like damp linen the moment Holmes exposed his contradiction. The butler's composure dissolved. In hushed tones, beneath the faded light of his servants' quarters, he confessed not to murder, but to conspiracy. He had indeed retrieved the Admiral's old medal from the desk and planted the copied note, hoping to provoke fear. It was blackmail in its most subtle form, drawn not with threats, but with reminders of Malta, of the past, of whatever the Admiral had buried in the Mediterranean sun. "I didn't want him dead," Keating insisted, his hands trembling. "I only wanted him to pay. What he did, what happened there, it destroyed people, Mr. Holmes. He thought it was forgotten, but I knew the truth, and so did Lyle." "The man in the root cellar?" Holmes said coldly. Keating looked away. "He was a signalman back then. He remembered everything. We meant to rattle the Admiral, to make him come forward, pay restitution even, but something else happened." "Yes," Holmes said. "Someone turned your charade into a murder." Gregson, who'd arrived midway through the confession, led Keating away under escort. Holmes watched them go, then turned to me. "Do you see it now, Watson?" "I see Keating was hiding the truth, yes. But we still don't know who killed the Admiral." "Precisely," Holmes said. "Because the blackmail was not the crime, it was the smoke. The real fire burns deeper." We returned to the study, now colder than ever, though the morning sun had risen behind the clouds. Holmes lit his pipe, inhaled once, and exhaled a slow plume that curled toward the ceiling. "Consider," he said, "that every suspect we've met so far has some reason to fear exposure. Rosamond with her broken engagement, Clara with her false name, Keating with his guilt, but none until now has had reason to hate." "Hate?" I echoed. He nodded. "Yes. This crime was not passionless. It was precise, yes, but there was malice behind it. I've seen it before. Revenge masquerading as justice." He stood abruptly. "It's time for me to begin a different kind of interrogation." "What sort?" "The one where I lie." Later that day, Holmes invited Miss Rosamond Penrose to the garden for tea. It was an odd request, and she complied warily, wrapped in a dark shawl despite the mildness of the day. The fog had lightened slightly, revealing the hedgerows and gravel paths with more clarity. Holmes sat across from her at a small wrought-iron table, tapping a spoon absently against his teacup. "You loved your father dearly," he said. She looked surprised. "Of course. Yet you rarely wept." "I don't cry in front of strangers, Mr. Holmes." "No, but your eyes were dry even when you were alone." She bristled. "What is this?" "I believe your father wronged someone in Malta, and I believe you know more about it than you've said." She stood up. "This is absurd." Holmes didn't rise. He suppressed an inquiry, didn't he? Buried evidence, kept a man from facing trial. "And someone died." She paused mid-step. I wasn't told the details, only that it was better if it was left behind." "But you learned the truth eventually." Her jaw tightened. "He confessed nothing," she said. "But I found letters. Burned mostly. One name remained. Thatcher. I asked once. He slapped me. I never asked again." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Thatcher. That's the name on the medallion's inscription, just barely visible on the inner rim." She sat slowly, her anger deflating. "I didn't kill him," she said. Holmes's voice was low. "But you know who might have." She hesitated. Then, "He had a visitor 3 nights ago. I heard the voice. A woman's." "A woman?" "Yes, late, well past 10. She spoke softly, but I heard her laugh once. Then," the Admiral shouted. Then silence. Holmes leaned forward. "Could it have been Clara?" Rosamond shook her head. "No, this woman's voice was older, deeper, someone with authority." Holmes's expression shifted. "Thank you. You've told me what I needed to hear." Holmes found me in the corridor soon after. "We've been looking in the wrong direction, Watson," he said. "We presumed the killing was a man's work. Brute force, strategic. But the voice Rosamond heard changes everything." "A woman, you mean?" He nodded. "An older one. Someone who knew the Admiral from long ago. Someone he feared." He lowered his voice. "And someone still within these walls." I stared at him. "Mrs. Prowse?" "Possibly. Or someone working through her. Think, Watson. The root cellar, the familiarity with the estate, the coded lamp. Keating played a part, but someone guided him. Someone who understood fear better than he did." We went at once to the kitchen, where Mrs. Prowse stood cleaning onions with stoic purpose. She did not appear startled to see us. "Afternoon, gentlemen," she said without looking up. Holmes wasted no time. "Mrs. Prowse, where were you 3 nights ago?" "At 10 o'clock. She raised an eyebrow. "Here, preparing for the next day." "Were you alone?" She gave him a cool glance. "The cook is often alone at night, sir. No one wants to visit the kitchen after supper." Holmes stepped closer. "Do you know the name Thatcher?" There was a flicker, barely noticeable, but Holmes caught it. "No," she said. He tilted his head. "You served the Admiral for 2 decades, cooked for him, heard him speak with guests." "It is hard to believe that name passed through this house without reaching your ears." "I didn't pry." "No," Holmes said, "but you remember." She set down the knife. Her hands were steady. "I knew Thatcher," she said at last. "She was my sister." My heart jolted. Holmes remained calm. "Go on." "She served with the Red Cross, stationed in Malta, cared for wounded officers. The Admiral, he betrayed her. She tried to expose the smuggling he was involved in, naval arms sold to foreign agents. She disappeared shortly after, presumed drowned, but I never believed it." "You came to Dunbridge to get close to him?" "Yes, but not to kill him, not at first. I only wanted to see if he remembered, if he regretted it." "He never did." Her voice grew thin. "He wore that bloody medal like it meant something." Holmes said nothing for a long time. Then he turned to me. "It all fits, Watson. The parcel was copied, but the motive was real. The whispers, the lamp, the body in the cellar, they were warning shots. But the Admiral never listened. And the murder?" Mrs. Prowse looked up, tears gleaming in her eyes for the first time. "I didn't strangle him," she said, "but I let the door stay unlocked. I told someone he was vulnerable." "Who?" Holmes asked gently. She hesitated. "Someone who lost a father in Malta. A girl Thatcher rescued once. Her ward. She found me last month. We planned to scare him. But I think—" She went further. Holmes nodded grimly. "Then we have our killer, and she's still in this house." Chapter 9. A Knife in the Dark. The house was no longer merely unsettled. It was tense, charged with a kind of quiet dread that moved through its corridors like a draught one couldn't quite place. The manor's stone bones seemed to hum with secrets, as if the walls themselves had borne witness to too much. Holmes did not speak for several hours following Mrs. Prowse's admission. He sat in the drawing-room's high-backed armchair, fingertips pressed together beneath his chin, eyes fixed upon the coals of the fire as if they whispered to him in Morse. I knew better than to interrupt him in such a state. Evening had fallen again before he stirred, rising with sudden purpose. "She's still here," he said, "and tonight she'll make her final move." "You're certain?" I asked. "She has no choice. The accomplice is dead. Keating has confessed his part. The illusion is crumbling around her. Her only hope is to eliminate the last threat, the last person who might know her truth." I frowned. Who would that be? Holmes gave me a grave look. "Mrs. Prowse." He stepped to the doorway. "Watson, gather Gregson. Double the constables. But make no noise. Tonight we lay the final trap." At Holmes's instruction, the household was sent early to bed under the guise of fatigue. Clara feigned illness. Rosamond retired with a book. Even Gregson, much grumbling under his breath, agreed to remain hidden with 2 men stationed near the servants' corridor. Mrs. Prowse had returned to the kitchen, continuing her work with the stoicism of a woman who'd prepared meals through wars and wakes alike. But her eyes betrayed her unease. She too felt the killer's shadow closing in. Holmes stationed himself in the study, though he left the door ajar and the lamp dimmed. I was in the hall just outside the kitchen, hidden behind a linen screen. The air was thick with anticipation, like the hush before a storm's first rumble. Then, shortly after midnight, it happened. A figure moved through the darkened corridor. Swift, deliberate steps. A woman, cloaked. She passed me without a sound, and entered the kitchen. Inside, the lantern was low. Mrs. Prowse stood at the table, cutting carrots, the rhythm of her knife steady and slow. She didn't look up as the woman entered. "I told you not to come back," she said softly. The visitor didn't respond. "I said we were done." Still silence. Then, "You let them find the medal," the visitor said at last. "You let him link it back." Her voice was low, tight with fury. Older than Clara or Rosamond, but carefully controlled, measured, the voice of a woman used to being overlooked. "You killed Lyle," Mrs. Prowse whispered. "He was weak. He would have confessed. You were meant to scare Penrose. That was the plan. Not murder." The woman stepped forward. "He murdered Thatcher. You said so yourself. Do you think a man like that deserves peace?" Mrs. Prowse trembled slightly. "You've made it worse. Now they're watching. Now they know. That's why you have to go." There was a hiss, a knife unsheathed. I burst through the door just as the blade flashed. Holmes was already behind her. "No further, Miss Fletcher," he said, seizing her wrist. The blade clattered to the floor. Clara Fletcher, the estate's former housemaid, presumed long gone, stood frozen in the lamplight, her disguise discarded. She was older now, yes, but unmistakable. the eyes sharp, the spine rigid with rage and grief. "You," Mrs. Prowse whispered, recoiling. "I told you she'd strike again," Holmes said grimly. Gregson entered with the constables. They secured Clara, who offered no resistance now, only silence. The interrogation came later in the quiet of the Admiral's study. Clara sat across from Holmes, wrists bound but posture proud. She met his gaze unflinchingly. "I was 13, she said. "Thatcher rescued me from a sinking transport ship. She gave me shelter, taught me to write, to fight, to see. When the Admiral tried to silence her, she sent me away, for my safety. I survived. She didn't." Holmes was quiet. "You returned to England," he said. "Changed your name. Joined service at Dunbridge under a false reference." "Waiting," she said. "Watching. I wasn't ready before." "And when Keating contacted you?" She nodded. "I saw his letters. I knew he wanted justice. But he wasn't willing to do what needed to be done. So I took over. You strangled the Admiral. He died easier than she did. And Lyle. An accident. He was panicking. I meant to scare him, but he tried to flee. He saw my face. I couldn't allow that." Holmes stood. "You killed 2 men to avenge a woman lost to the sea." "She wasn't lost," Clara whispered. "She was discarded." Holmes didn't reply. Gregson took her away. There was no protest. Later that night, Holmes and I sat in the garden under the bare-limbed sycamore tree, the fog curling between us like smoke. "You knew it was her," I said, "all along." "I suspected," Holmes replied. "Too many things didn't fit. Clara's vague past, her strangely timed departure from service, her knowledge of the household's inner workings even after she'd left. But I needed her to make the final move, to expose herself. And she nearly murdered Mrs. Prowse to do it." "Yes," he said. "But guilt is an impatient partner. It makes people reckless." I shivered. "Was it justice?" Holmes lit his pipe. "Justice, Watson, wears many masks. Tonight it wore a young woman's grief and an old woman's silence." He paused, then added, "But justice should never wield a blade in the dark." Chapter 10. The Ghost Beneath the Medals. The morning after Clara's arrest dawned wet and grey. Rain clung to the windows in thin veils, and a wind from the coast swept through the house with restless fingers. Dunbridge Manor, for all its prestige and stone, felt like a hollow carcass. And yet, in the aftermath of the attempted murder, the household stirred as if from a long, bitter sleep. Gregson had left to transport Clara to London, promising a full deposition and charges to follow. Keating, still under scrutiny, remained in custody nearby, and Rosamond, pale and drawn, had locked herself in the Admiral's old study and refused breakfast. It was Watson and I who walked the corridors, the only ones, it seemed, still compelled by the lingering presence of a deeper truth. For although Clara had confessed to the murder, and though her motives were plain, something in Holmes's expression told me that the matter was not yet closed. "You're not satisfied," I said as we descended the narrow servant stairs toward the cellar again. "No," Holmes murmured, "because Clara's motive, though tragic, is insufficient to explain the precision of the crime. Revenge is rarely so disciplined. She had the cause, yes, but not the cunning. There is more, Watson. The crime still bears another signature." We reached the root cellar. The body of Lyle had been removed, of course, but the space still carried the heaviness of death. Holmes walked the perimeter in silence, then paused near the wall where crates of salted meat had once stood. He knelt and reached behind a timber beam. "There," he said. He pulled out a long, narrow tin box, rusted at the hinges but intact. "What is it?" I asked. He opened it. Inside were several letters, folded with precision. Navy parchment, stamped with the seal of the Royal Mediterranean Command. One bore the Admiral's handwriting. Holmes read aloud. "March 14th, 1868. Malta. To Vice Admiral Harcourt, as per your request, I have successfully transferred the 5 crates without incident. Miss Thatcher remains persistent in her inquiries. I suggest she be removed before the board in London becomes aware of her reports. These actions may be unpleasant, but they preserve the greater good. The arms have already crossed to Alexandria. Our cause must not be hindered by sentiment. Penrose. I stared at the letter in disbelief. My God, he was smuggling weapons. Arms intended for diplomatic support, Holmes said. Or so they justified it. But in truth, they sold them for profit to intermediaries in North Africa. Miss Thatcher discovered the transfers. She was silenced for it. And Harcourt, I asked. Was he complicit? Holmes held up the next letter. Harcourt's seal visible. The ink faded. She's no longer a problem. The sea has taken her. Maintain your post. History will absolve us. I felt a sickness settle in my stomach. All this time, I muttered. He was never a hero. He wore his medals like armor, but they were earned in deceit. Holmes placed the letters back in the tin with care. Clara killed him for what he did to her guardian. But someone else, someone clever, kept these letters hidden. Keating may have known about them, but he was too fearful to act directly. This box was meant to stay buried, but I believe it was recently disturbed. He stood and looked toward the stairwell. Only one person had unfettered access to this part of the house. Someone trusted. Someone overlooked. My mind raced. You don't mean... Holmes didn't reply. He was already halfway up the stairs. We found Rosamond in the Admiral's study, seated at the desk in his old chair. She had changed into one of her father's coats. It hung from her shoulders like a relic. "You've come to accuse me?" she asked, her voice brittle. Holmes studied her for a long moment. "I've come to ask you why you kept the letters hidden." She didn't flinch. "They weren't mine to show." "But you read them?" "Yes." "And you knew what he'd done?" A pause. "I suspected, then I knew." Holmes approached the desk slowly. "You loved him, despite what he was." She laughed, dry, bitter. "I worshipped him. Like a child worships a distant star. He told me nothing. But after his death I searched. I thought, perhaps if I found why, it would make sense. That he was protecting something noble, but no. Just greed, just silence." "Why not come forward?" I asked. "Why not share the letters?" She looked away. "Because it would destroy his memory. And mine. I spent my life defending him to the world, Watson. To myself. And when Clara arrived, when her past began to flicker beneath her disguise, I knew it would all come undone." Holmes sat across from her. "You weren't the killer," he said, "but you knew Clara's intentions. You saw her rage, and you let her in that night." She nodded slowly. I unlocked the study door. Then I went back to bed. Watson stared. "You handed him to her." "I couldn't stop her, and maybe I didn't want to." Silence hung thick. Holmes's voice was soft. "And the tin box?" "I found it years ago," she whispered. "Buried beneath the floorboards. He must have panicked and hidden it. I kept it. I don't know why. Perhaps because I needed to believe he'd answer for it someday." Holmes stood and looked out the window. "There will be no trial for your father. But there will be a reckoning." Rosamond did not move. "I know." That evening, Holmes and I left Dunbridge. The manor faded behind us like a ghost swallowed by fog. Neither of us spoke for some time. It was not a case that lent itself to triumph. On the train to London, I finally asked what had been weighing on me since the discovery of the letters. "Would you have turned them over, Holmes, if she hadn't admitted them?" He didn't answer right away. "Then, there are truths, Watson. That must be told, even when they hurt. And if they shatter someone's world." He glanced out the window. Then we pick up the pieces, or we leave them behind. But we do not build monuments on lies. He closed his eyes. The dead have had their say. Now the living must make peace with them. Chapter 11. A letter never sent. It had been 3 days since we left Dunbridge Manor behind. Its silent halls, veiled truths, and memories neither gentle nor kind. The case might have ended for Scotland Yard with Clara Fletcher's arrest and Rosamond Penrose's quiet withdrawal from public life, but for Holmes the resolution was not so neatly tied. I had grown accustomed to his brooding silences in the aftermath of a complex investigation. But this was different. Holmes had not merely withdrawn. He was calculating. In Baker Street, he moved as though some invisible current still pulled at him. He spent long hours pacing before the fireplace, jotting fragments in his notebook, tapping his fingers in patterns I suspected were Morse. Whatever remained unfinished in his mind refused to be banished. On the 4th morning, as I prepared to return to my practice, Holmes halted me with a single word. Wait. He stood by the window, eyes following a cab across the street. I believe we have one final thread to tug, Watson. One that may expose the hand that never touched the body, but guided the blade all the same. I set down my gloves. You mean Rosamond? Holmes shook his head. No, I mean someone above Rosamond, someone whose name appeared only briefly in those letters. Vice Admiral Harcourt. I blinked, but Harcourt was mentioned only once, and those letters are decades old. Holmes stepped toward his desk, opened a drawer, and retrieved a neatly folded page. It was stamped with the seal of the Admiralty. I sent a message, he explained, a query regarding Harcourt's current whereabouts, retirement records, and any disciplinary actions filed after 1870. This, he held up the paper, is the reply. I leaned over to read. Vice Admiral Nathaniel Harcourt died in 1872. Heart failure at his home in Devonshire. No formal inquiries on record. Estate passed to his niece, Mrs. Eleanor Harcourt Fletcher. I looked up slowly. Fletcher? Holmes nodded. Clara Fletcher's adoptive mother. I let the weight of the revelation settle. It changed everything. Then Clara wasn't just Thatcher's ward, I said. She was Harcourt's niece as well. Precisely. Her vengeance was not only for Thatcher. It was also for betrayal within her own bloodline. Harcourt arranged Thatcher's death, and then took her ward under his protection. Guilt, perhaps, or control. But that connection never came up, I said. Clara never mentioned it. She didn't need to. She buried it as deeply as she buried her name. But Harcourt's estate passed quietly to Clara in the 1890s. Allowed her to disappear from record until she re-emerged at Dunbridge, playing the maid. Holmes began to pace. I believe someone else knew, someone who orchestrated events to bring Clara and Penrose back into collision, someone who saw in their shared grief the perfect storm. You mean Keating? Holmes stopped. No, Keating was a pawn, no more. The true manipulator remains at large. Which is why, Watson, I have written a letter. He produced a sealed envelope addressed to Miss Rosamond Penrose, Dunbridge Manor. What does it say? I asked. Merely that I have uncovered a final document among the Admiral's personal effects, one that changes the entire interpretation of his involvement in Malta, and that I shall arrive in person with Scotland Yard within 48 hours. I stared at him. But that's not true. Not yet. He smiled thinly. But it will be enough to rattle the tree. And if I'm right, our phantom will emerge. We arrived at Dunbridge the next evening just before dusk. The manor had grown even quieter, its few remaining staff tight-lipped and wary. Rosamond met us at the door, thinner than before, wrapped in a heavy shawl, her expression unreadable. You said you found something, she said without preamble. I did, Holmes replied, handing her the sealed copy of the letter. but I thought it best to deliver it in person." She led us into the study without another word. The fire had not been lit. Bookshelves loomed like silent judges, and the Admiral's desk remained as he had left it, neat, austere, untouched. "I haven't sat in this room since you left," she said. "It doesn't feel like mine." Holmes stepped to the fireplace and stared into the empty grate. "There's one question that still troubles me," he said. "Why you let Clara in? Why you watched her slip past your bedroom and open the door to your father's study?" Rosamond's hands clenched slightly, but she said nothing. "I believe you recognized her," Holmes continued. "Not as a former maid, but as someone you saw as a girl, someone who visited your father during long-forgotten evenings. Perhaps you overheard them speaking of Malta, of Thatcher." Rosamond exhaled slowly. "Yes, I remembered her the moment she returned. But I didn't say a word." "Why?" "Because I wanted to know if she was brave enough to do what I wasn't." Holmes nodded. And she was. There was a knock at the door. A housemaid entered, wide-eyed. "Miss Penrose, there's a man here. He says you sent for him." Rosamond's brow furrowed. "I sent for no one." The maid glanced toward Holmes, then back at Rosamond. "He's outside. Says he's your solicitor." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Don't move," he whispered. He stepped past us and made for the entryway, disappearing into the corridor. I followed. Outside, beneath the portico, stood a tall man in a dark overcoat, holding a briefcase. "Ah," he said when he saw Holmes. "Forgive the intrusion. I'm looking for Miss Penrose." "And you are?" Holmes asked. "Jonathan Frey. I handle her father's posthumous affairs. There were matters unresolved regarding a Maltese trust." Holmes tilted his head. "Odd." "Because I believe you've never stepped foot in this house before, and your accent, though polished, is unmistakably colonial. South African, perhaps." Frey stiffened. Holmes took a step forward. "You were in Malta during the smuggling affair. You served under Harcourt, and I dare say you were his clerk." Frey's eyes narrowed. "You've no proof?" "Not yet," Holmes said. "But you orchestrated everything, didn't you? You contacted Keating, fed him old rumors. You sent Clara the note that reignited her fury. You leaked the copy of the Malta memorandum. You knew exactly who would act and how." Frey's face grew dark. "You think you understand what Malta was? We saved England's naval flank. Your courts would never understand." "No," Holmes said softly. "But Clara did. And she made you irrelevant. That's why you're here now, trying to silence Rosamond before she speaks." Holmes turned just as Gregson and 2 constables emerged from the path beyond. "Arrest this man for conspiracy to commit murder and obstruction of justice." Frey lunged, but Holmes sidestepped neatly. Within seconds, it was over. Later that night, Rosamond sat beside the fireplace as we prepared to leave. "So, it was him," she murmured. Holmes nodded. "The spider behind the web. He planted the clues to provoke Clara, manipulated Keating to stage the Morse lamp, and hoped to bury the truth under layers of vengeance." She touched the letter Holmes had brought. "And the document you claimed to find?" He smiled faintly. "Still unwritten, but perhaps you'll write it." Rosamond looked at the fire, her father's shadow dancing in the flames. "I think I will." Chapter 12. The glint behind the frame. 2 days passed. Back at Baker Street, Holmes resumed his habitual silence, broken only by the scratch of his violin or the ticking of the mantel clock. Clara Fletcher's confession, Rosamond's reckoning, and Jonathan Frey's arrest might have unraveled the strands of the case for others, but for Holmes, the puzzle was not yet whole. It was on the 3rd evening, as I read a newspaper article regarding the smuggling scandal now surfacing in the House of Commons, that Holmes rose from his chair with the abruptness of inspiration. "I've been a fool, Watson." This, I knew, was no small admission. "You recall the Admiral's study?" he said. The way everything was placed, almost reverently, as though it had not been touched for years. Yes, Rosamond said she hadn't sat in there since the funeral. Holmes nodded. And yet one object remained strangely out of place. The portrait above the fireplace. Did you not notice? I cast my mind back. It was a large naval painting, I said, of Penrose in full uniform. Exactly, and hung slightly off-center, just enough to suggest recent movement. Holmes was already reaching for his coat. Come, Watson. We're not quite finished at Dunbridge, after all. The manor was quieter still when we returned, almost funereal. Rosamond admitted us without question, her face bearing the calm of someone who had wept and decided never to again. Holmes strode directly to the study and stood before the painting. With a swift motion, he lifted it from the hook. A hidden alcove behind the frame was revealed, narrow, dustless, and empty save for a single leather-bound ledger. He pulled it free. A record, he said, flipping through it. Written in the Admiral's hand, names, dates, ship transfers, transactions coded under false headings. It is the true archive of the Malta affair. He stopped at a page dated May 1869. Here, he whispered. Thatcher, Harcourt, Fletcher. There, scrawled beneath a set of ciphered entries, was a name Holmes traced slowly with his finger. Jonathan Fry, intermediary, Cape Town relay. I drew in a sharp breath. Holmes closed the book gently. This is the piece I was missing, he said. Not the motive, not the method, but the bridge. The connection that proved Frey wasn't merely complicit. He was central. He didn't just orchestrate Clara's descent. He protected his own secrets by turning victims into instruments. Rosamond stood in the doorway, silent. She stepped forward, eyes on the book. Will they prosecute him? She asked. With this, Holmes said, they'll have no choice. She nodded slowly, then turned to leave. At the threshold, she paused. Mr. Holmes? Yes? What made you come back to that painting? Holmes glanced at me, then said softly, because grief rarely leaves things neat, and your father was many things, but careless with appearances, he was not. Outside, the wind had turned bitter. We descended the manor steps as a cold drizzle began to fall, the final pieces of the case settling into place like frost across a field. An elegant trap, I murmured. Conspiracy layered in misdirection. Blackmail nested in grief, and yet a single painting betrayed them. Holmes smiled faintly. Even the most calculated men forget the weight of the past, Watson. It shifts paintings, it tilts frames, and eventually it cracks walls. He tucked the ledger beneath his arm. The rest I shall send to Scotland Yard. Let the law take its course. And you? I asked. He looked out over the moor, where the last traces of fog clung to the hedgerows like ghosts reluctant to depart. I, he said, have heard all I need. The lamp has flickered its final signal. Chapter 13. A Ticket to Trieste. The dawn after our return to London broke sharp and rainless, a rare clarity in a city more often swaddled in smoke. But that clarity did not extend to Scotland Yard, where the wheels of justice were turning sluggishly. Despite Holmes's ledger and Frey's arrest, delays and hesitations abounded. Vice Admiral Harcourt's name, even dead these decades, seemed to cast a long, choking shadow through certain corridors of government. Files vanished, testimonies blurred, and key officials suddenly found themselves unavailable for questioning. Holmes saw it all with quiet contempt. This is the real crime, Watson, he murmured one afternoon as he sorted correspondence at Baker Street. When power rots, it does so politely, and no one smells the stench. Then came the telegram. Delivered by hand. No signature. Watch the docks. Midnight. SS Carpathia. Frey moves before the tide. Holmes stared at the paper a moment too long before folding it. "He's running," he said, "which means someone has cleared the path for him." "Are we going?" I asked. Holmes was already at the door. The docks were shrouded in mist, as though the river itself conspired to blur wrong from right. Crates lined the wharf, sailors moved with silent urgency, and in the distance the black hull of the SS Carpathia loomed like a floating tomb. Holmes and I moved like shadows, cloaked in greatcoats, our boots silent against the wet planks. He motioned toward a group of passengers gathered by the boarding ramp, 10 or 12 figures, some cloaked, some plainly dressed. Then I saw him. Jonathan Frey, suitcase in hand, moving with a briskness that suggested both practiced ease and concealed panic. His coat was freshly pressed, his beard trimmed. He looked like a man departing on business, not a fugitive slipping past justice. Holmes whispered, "He'll wait until the last minute. Less attention that way." As the ship's final bell rang, Fry moved. But so did Holmes. He intercepted him 10 paces from the ramp. "Going somewhere warm, Mr. Fry." Frey froze. Then, slowly, he turned. "I have no idea what you mean." "I think you do," Holmes replied. "And I believe your ticket bears the name Jonas Franklin. A lovely false identity, clean papers, forged 2 days ago in Whitechapel, if I'm not mistaken." Frey's expression didn't waver, but his grip on the suitcase tightened. "You won't stop this," he said. "The ministry will bury your little book in an archive so deep it won't see daylight for 50 years, and no one will care. You think you've won? There's nothing left to charge me with." "I disagree," Holmes said. "Smuggling, conspiracy, manipulation of a murder, all provable." Frey stepped back a half step. "Prove it in a court of your real England. They'll thank me for cleaning up the past." Then he moved. Fast. A sharp pivot, suitcase dropped, elbow toward Holmes's throat, but Holmes had been ready. He ducked, spun, and drove a knee into Frey's midsection with such speed and grace that the man crumpled to the dock before he could even cry out. A small revolver skidded from Frey's coat across the wood. I picked it up. "Insurance?" I asked him. He wheezed on the planks, eyes narrowed. "You'll regret this." "I rarely regret accuracy," Holmes replied coldly. He gestured toward a constable just arriving at the edge of the pier. "Take this man into custody. Ship's registry will show his intent to flee. Scotland Yard will receive the ledger within the hour." The constable nodded, securing Frey with a set of iron cuffs. As Frey was led away, he hissed one final remark toward Holmes. "She'll never be free of it, you know. Rosamond. Some truths ruin even the innocent." Holmes said nothing. Only watched him vanish into the fog. Later, back at Baker Street, Holmes sat with his hands folded and eyes distant. The fog outside had thickened again, curling against the window panes like smoke searching for a way in. "Do you believe him?" I asked. "About Rosamond?" Holmes didn't look up. "She will carry the shadow," he said quietly. "Not because she's guilty, but because she was close enough to the fire to feel the burn." He stood, moving to the fireplace. "But guilt, Watson, is a clever thing. It clings to those who survive, not those who perish." He paused, and Rosamond survived. Chapter 14. The Message That Never Blinked. It was 2 mornings after Frey's attempted flight that I found Holmes already awake and seated cross-legged upon the floor of our Baker Street sitting room. The old Morse lamp from Dunbridge Manor, acquired by Holmes after Gregson declared it irrelevant, now sat on a tray before him. Its bulb was intact, its copper housing still scuffed with grime. A notebook lay open beside it, filled with sequences of dots and dashes. "You're decoding the lamp?" I asked, rubbing sleep from my eyes. "No," Holmes replied without looking up. "I'm listening to what was never said." I blinked. "I don't follow." He looked up at me then, eyes gleaming with focus. "This lamp was the first anomaly of the case. The flickering Morse, the message without apparent meaning. Gregson believed it to be nothing more than Clara's theatrics. But the device itself, this exact model, was not part of the house's fittings. It was brought in. That alone warranted deeper curiosity. He tapped the notebook with a finger. I've reconstructed the blinking sequence from Watson's earlier notes and the constable's report. The message repeated only once. THATCH. And then it cut out. Thatcher, I whispered. Holmes nodded. But it never completed the name. Someone interrupted the sequence. He stood and walked to the window, the lamp cradled in his hands. The flickering wasn't meant to expose Clara. It was meant to frighten her, or perhaps force her hand. Force her to do what? Reveal her identity, or take revenge faster than planned. The lamp was used to apply pressure. He turned sharply. And I believe I know who rigged it. We returned to Dunbridge that afternoon, under the pretense of collecting personal items Holmes had left behind. Rosamond greeted us at the door with a wary grace. Her composure had hardened, her grief now worn like polished armor. I thought the case was finished, she said as Holmes removed his coat. It is nearly, Holmes replied. But I must ask a final question regarding the lamp. Rosamond frowned. The one in the attic? Holmes nodded. You were unaware it had been moved. I haven't been up there in years. He led us up the narrow servant stair to the topmost floor, to the storage room where the Morse lamp had first been found. Dust still lay heavy across the wooden slats. In the corner, a crate sat open where the lamp had once perched. Holmes crouched by it, examining the base. There, he murmured. He drew out a sliver of paper wedged between the crate and floorboard, a torn label. He handed it to me. Property of the Admiralty, Communications Division, inventory date, Sept. 1869. My eyes widened. This lamp was military issue. Indeed, Holmes said, and not just any lamp. It belonged to a ship used in the Malta deployments, specifically one assigned to Harcourt's fleet. Rosamond was silent. Holmes stood. Miss Penrose, who besides you and Clara had access to this attic. She hesitated. Keating, and the groundskeeper, but he left last spring. Holmes nodded slowly. But I think the answer lies not in who used the lamp, but how they expected it to be read. Clara would have recognized the Morse. She learned it from Thatcher. But no one else in the house would have made sense of it. Except, I said, understanding dawning, someone who knew she'd recognize it. Holmes turned to Rosamond. You didn't set the lamp, but you found it flickering, didn't you? She flinched, just barely. Yes. 3 nights before the murder. I thought it was a fuse. I unplugged it. Holmes stepped closer. And you didn't tell anyone. She said nothing. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he softened. You weren't protecting Clara. You were protecting yourself from the guilt of knowing the house still held ghosts. Rosamond's voice cracked. I thought it was his ghost, she whispered, signaling from beyond. Holmes placed a hand on her shoulder. It was no ghost. It was a man trying to control a woman with memory. A final cruel reminder from Frey, meant to awaken the pain he had buried for decades. She nodded, eyes damp. Holmes stepped back. It's over now. The last flicker has faded. That evening, as we rode the train back to London under a golden dusk, I turned to Holmes. You always knew the case was bigger than Clara's crime, didn't you? He folded his arms and leaned into the window. No, Watson, I suspected. Knowing required listening to what wasn't said, observing what didn't happen. The lamp taught me that. He closed his eyes. And so did she. Chapter 15. Faces in the drawing room. It was late afternoon when Holmes and I returned once more to Dunbridge Manor. The clouds rolled in heavy from the coast, lending the estate a grayness that felt more symbolic than meteorological. Inside, fires were lit, but the air remained thick, less from the autumn chill and more from the weight of what was about to unfold. Holmes had sent the summons earlier that morning. Short, direct invitations addressed to the last remaining players of the Dunbridge affair. One by one they arrived as requested. Scotland Yard's Inspector Gregson was the first, carrying the stiff unease of a man who felt the case had closed days ago. Keating, pale and freshly released, entered behind him, eyes hollow but darting. And finally, Rosamond Penrose, silent as ever, took her seat by the cold fireplace. Even Clara Fletcher, under close guard, had been permitted to return, escorted and handcuffed, but strangely calm. They were all assembled in the Admiral's drawing room, the same space where he had once hosted naval officers and statesmen. Now, it was a theatre of reckoning. Holmes stood before the hearth, fingertips pressed together, surveying them like an orchestra conductor before the overture. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "thank you for indulging me one final time. I assure you this gathering will not be wasted. For though arrests have been made and confessions given, there remains a question unresolved." He paused, letting the silence stretch. Who truly orchestrated the murder of Admiral Edward Penrose? A murmur passed between Gregson and Keating. Rosamond lowered her gaze. Clara's expression did not change. Holmes continued. Clara Fletcher confessed, yes. But the motive she cited, the death of her guardian Evelyn Thatcher, was only half the story. In truth, she was manipulated. Pushed, provoked. He turned toward Clara. "You received a note, did you not? Anonymously slipped into your laundry on your second day here. A note that read, 'He still lives, and the lamp will speak.'" Clara's lips parted slightly. It was the first time anyone else in the room had heard of it. Holmes lifted a folded page from his pocket. "I have the handwriting matched. It belongs to one Jonathan Fry, former clerk to Vice Admiral Harcourt, central to the Malta smuggling affair, and the man who attempted to flee aboard the SS Carpathia just days ago." Gregson sat forward, face tightening. "You're saying Frey engineered the whole thing?" "I am," Holmes replied. "Frey leaked documents. He planted the Morse lamp. He sent the note to Clara. He knew that resurrecting Thatcher's ghost would drive her toward the Admiral. But he miscalculated." "How?" asked Rosamond quietly. "Because Clara had already chosen silence," Holmes said. "She'd lived with the truth for years. The lamp only confirmed what she feared. But it wasn't until she found your father's journal, hidden behind the portrait, that she made her decision." He turned now to Keating. "And you. You were Frey's tool. You thought you were uncovering something heroic, didn't you? That the blinking light proved a code or spy. But Frey was using your ambition." Keating's face flushed. I only wanted recognition," Holmes finished. "As did Frey. He wanted to bury the last witness to Malta's crimes and ensure the record remained his to shape." Rosamond's silence, Clara's rage, Keating's foolishness, it all played into his plan. He let the room digest the weight of it. Then he opened the Admiral's leather journal and placed it on the desk. "In here lies every transaction, every shipment, every betrayal. It is, in the end, the Admiral's own confession, and it vindicates Thatcher. It condemns Harcourt. It names Frey. It shows us that war can corrupt even the most decorated." Clara spoke then, voice calm. "And what of me?" Holmes looked at her. "You committed murder, but in that moment you were also manipulated by a man who murdered with ink and silence long before you ever held a blade." Gregson stood. "We'll present it all to the magistrate. The Crown will weigh everything." Holmes nodded. "One last thing," he said, his tone quieter now. "The lamp. It was meant to flicker her past back to life, but it also flickered the truth into the open." He turned to Rosamond. You saw it that night and said nothing. I thought it was a ghost, she said. In a way, Holmes murmured. It was. As the gathering dispersed and Clara was escorted out, Holmes and I remained behind. The fire crackled faintly. Rain began tapping against the high windows. I asked, "Do you think Clara will hang?" "No," Holmes said. "She may live a quiet, forgotten life in a sanatorium. But history will be kinder to her than to those who forged peace from betrayal." "And you?" Holmes stared into the flames. "I will forget the faces, but not the flicker." Chapter 16. The Lamp in Reverse. The following evening, Holmes agreed, at last, to dictate the full breakdown of the case. We sat in our lodgings at Baker Street, a modest fire flickering in the grate, and I, pen in hand, was prepared to transcribe his words for posterity. But rather than begin at the end, Holmes, as always, chose to start from the beginning. "The case," he said, "did not begin with a murder, it began with a signal." He gestured toward the dismantled Morse lamp on the desk beside him. That flickering bulb, erratic, seemingly nonsensical, was a message, yes, but not in the way we initially understood. It was not a cry for help. It was not even a code. It was a match, a spark placed to ignite the past in Clara Fletcher's mind. A provocation. He stood and paced slowly. Frey, having remained hidden for years, began to feel the noose tighten. Certain records about the Malta scandal were resurfacing in naval archives. Rumors in Parliament. He realized that if Clara or Rosamond were ever to speak of what they knew or suspected, his name would not survive it. "So," I said, "he acted preemptively." "Precisely," Holmes replied. "He inserted himself into the narrative with invisible ink. He sent Clara the note. He still lives. And the lamp will speak," which played on a deeply buried fear that Penrose, or the ghost of his crimes, still had power. Clara's trauma, sharpened by years of silence and her complicated loyalty to Thatcher's memory, made her vulnerable to such manipulation. But how did he know she'd be there? He didn't. He arranged for her to be. Using a former contact within the staffing agency, Frey orchestrated her placement. A well-paid nudge here, a forged recommendation there. Easy enough. Holmes returned to his seat, and once she arrived, he ensured the elements of memory would surround her. The portrait of Harcourt, the locked study, the naval journals, and of course, the Morse lamp. Familiar but unspoken. "And Rosamond?" I asked. "Miss Penrose was both a target and a tool," Holmes said. Frey assumed she would remain silent, too scarred to investigate further. He gambled that she would either break under guilt or retreat entirely. What he failed to understand is that guilt in Rosamond had turned not to cowardice, but to watchfulness. She suspected Clara. Yes, but she also began to suspect the echoes of her father's legacy. Holmes leaned forward. The moment of real transformation came when Clara found the Admiral's ledger hidden behind the portrait. That was the true moment of murder, not when the blade pierced flesh, but when the past could no longer be denied. He tapped the lamp again. "That device," he said, "served more than one purpose. It was Frey's reminder to Clara, but also a false clue to the rest of us. It distracted Scotland Yard, misled Keating, and even tempted me into believing the crime had a mechanical source. It was misdirection in its purest form." "And Keating?" I asked. "Do you believe he was innocent?" "Insofar as a man can be a fool without being wicked," Holmes answered. "He fancied himself a seeker of truth, but in truth he followed breadcrumbs laid by a master manipulator. His ego was as blind as it was brittle." I paused, then asked the question I'd long harbored. "And you, Holmes? When did you know?" He smiled faintly. "When I noticed the lamp's flickering wasn't timed correctly. Morse code is precise. The The delays between letters were inconsistent, as though the hand behind it had never used it for communication, only for effect. That's when I realized it wasn't a message, it was a trigger. He stood again, moving to the window. The rain had returned, soft and ceaseless. "There is justice in Clara's confession," he said quietly. "But there is tragedy in the fact that, without phrase manipulation, she may never have acted. The Admiral's death, while a reckoning, was also a symptom." He turned to me. "And in that sense, Watson, this was not a single crime. It was a chain reaction, decades long, fueled by silence, corruption, and the ghosts men refused to bury." I closed my notebook, pen resting on the last line. Holmes stood still, the lamp casting long shadows across the room. And in the hush that followed, I could almost believe it still flickered, spelling out a truth no Morse could contain. Chapter 17. The Last Echo of the Lamp. The trial was brief, as such proceedings go, yet steeped in the kind of quiet scandal that never quite finds its way into the broadsheets. The Crown, wary of the damage a full airing might inflict on certain retired officers and still-shadowed institutions, opted for a narrow scope: the murder of Admiral Penrose by Clara Fletcher and the attempted flight and historical criminality of Jonathan Fry. Frey, to his credit, or perhaps out of a final act of self-preservation, pleaded guilty to charges of conspiracy and obstruction of justice. He offered no testimony and refused cross-examination, his counsel noting merely that the pressures of his former life had returned. In his final court appearance, he stood with his head bowed, gaunt and hollow-eyed. Like a man who had finally outrun even his own shadow, he was sentenced to 14 years in Dartmoor. Clara Fletcher's fate, however, was less easily decided. Her confession had been complete, uncoerced, and consistent. She made no appeal for mercy, only asked that the Admiral's journal be made part of the public record. Her testimony during the preliminary hearings was poised, devoid of theatrics, and heartbreakingly sincere. She spoke not as a killer, but as a daughter denied truth and dignity for decades. Public sentiment tilted in her favor. Whispers among court officials suggested pressure from behind-the-scenes figures, men whose names appeared in the Malta pages, ensured the case would not become a political reckoning. In the end, the judge, citing extenuating psychological trauma, manipulation by external forces, and deep moral provocation, ruled that Clara Fletcher was guilty but unfit for conventional punishment. She was committed to a private sanatorium outside Bath, under the care of Dr. Harold Murstow, where she would live quietly and without bars. Whether it was mercy or another kind of forgetting, no one could say. Holmes and I visited her only once. It was a mild afternoon in early spring. The sanatorium stood atop a quiet hill, the wind carrying the scent of budding lilacs and fresh earth. Clara greeted us in the gardens, seated on a wrought-iron bench with a book open in her lap. The Lighthouse at the End of Things, by Evelyn Thatcher. She smiled at Holmes with the distant calm of someone who had stepped away from the world's noise and found peace in silence. "I wanted to thank you," she said softly. Holmes shook his head. "No thanks are owed. What I did was only to follow the flickers." She looked to me. "Does he ever speak plainly?" she asked with a ghost of a smile. "Rarely," I said. "But he means well." Holmes tilted his head. "You carry the weight of many ghosts, Miss Fletcher. But know this, your voice broke a chain others never dared touch. Thatcher would have been proud." Her eyes welled then, just briefly. But she did not cry. As we left, she turned once more to the page in her lap. "Do you believe," she asked, "that guilt ever dies?" Holmes paused. "No," he replied, "but sometimes it sleeps." Back in London, the case disappeared from the headlines within a fortnight. Scotland Yard issued a modest commendation to Inspector Gregson, and the official line read that With diligence and timely collaboration, a decades-old grievance was resolved with minimal loss of life. I penned the account under a pseudonym, The Lamp That Flickered, and saw it published in a modest periodical concerned with historical crimes. It was not a bestseller. It was not meant to be. What mattered was that it existed, a record, a light in the archives. As for Rosamond Penrose, she remained at Dunbridge. The estate shrank to half its former staff, and many rooms were closed permanently. But she reopened the West Wing, where the Admiral's study had stood, and transformed it into a reading room for the village children. She wrote to us once, enclosing a pressed flower and a short note. The fog has finally cleared. R.P. That evening, as Holmes and I sat beneath the dim glow of our Baker Street lamp, I asked him what he had taken from the affair, what lesson, if any, had imprinted itself upon his method. He sat for a long time, the fire whispering at his heels. At first, I thought the lamp had signaled a crime, he said. But I was wrong. It signaled a wound, a pulse from the past, blinking to life just long enough to be seen. He exhaled slowly. And perhaps, he added, some truths must flicker before they can burn. Chapter 18. The Flicker That Remained. The case was closed. The name of Admiral Penrose had vanished from conversation, tucked away between the folds of military honors and the polite forgetting of officialdom. The Morse lamp was boxed and returned to Holmes's storage trunk, a symbolic burial of the object that had ignited memory, murder, and meaning. And yet some part of it clung to us both. It was a grey April morning when I found Holmes seated alone at our Baker Street window, a barely touched cup of tea cooling on the sill beside him. Rain tapped against the panes. The same rhythm that had haunted us in Dunbridge Manor, and beyond him the city stretched like a sleeping beast. He didn't speak at first. He rarely did when he was thinking, not thinking to solve a puzzle, but thinking to understand a person. Clara's confession, he said eventually, was never about guilt, Watson. It was a surrender. I lowered my newspaper. Surrender to what? To the truth, he replied, and not just her own. She surrendered to the fact that some truths are not healed by justice or by revenge, but by being spoken aloud. He rose and moved toward the hearth, hands tucked behind his back. Consider what we uncovered. A murder, yes, but also a conspiracy decades old. War crimes repackaged as medals. A young woman erased from memory. And in the middle of it all, a blinking lamp, used first to conceal, then to reveal. He turned toward me, that familiar sharp glint in his eye returning. Frey didn't anticipate that the lamp would illuminate more than Clara's past. He used it to signal fear. But fear is not a controlled substance. It spills, spreads. It touched Rosamond. It inflamed Keating. It intrigued you and me. And it became, in the end, his undoing. I nodded slowly, because he couldn't control what the signal meant once it was seen. Precisely, Holmes said. A lie has boundaries. The truth does not. He walked to the sideboard and drew out the final sheet of the Admiral's journal, the last entry, torn and scorched slightly at the corner. I had read it once. Its words still clung to me. I told myself it was duty, that the men I named were greater threats than the ones I protected. I told myself that someday someone would understand, but war is not remembered in context, only in winners and martyrs. I was neither. Holmes stared at it for a moment, then folded it with surprising gentleness and placed it back in its envelope. I sometimes wonder, he mused, if we are solving crimes or simply peeling back illusions. You mean justice is never really served? Not neatly, Watson. Not in the stories we are told. We act as if resolution is a door one steps through, but often it is a mirror. And when the dust settles, what's left is not closure, but consequence. I let that linger. Would you have done what Clara did? I asked, not quite sure why I needed the answer. Holmes smiled, an expression touched by both melancholy and irony. "I do not deal in hypotheticals of the heart," he said. "But I will say this. Her crime was a wound, a terrible, raw one. But so was the silence that preceded it." He moved toward the mantel where the Morse lamp once sat. In its place now rested a simple brass oil lamp, unremarkable. Still, "She flickered before she burned," he said. "That evening I sat at my desk, rereading my account of the case, wondering, as I often did, what Holmes saw in it that I did not. The facts were there, the deductions, the timeline, and yet something in it felt larger, deeper. In the quiet, I thought again of the moment Clara stood before Penrose with the truth clenched in her fist. Not vengeance, not madness, just a truth that had outgrown its silence. I looked up to see Holmes dozing in his armchair, legs stretched out, head tilted slightly, the rain still murmuring on the glass behind him. The flicker, I realized, had not come from the lamp at all. It had come from her. From Clara Fletcher, blinking in the dark, sending out one last signal. And someone, finally, had seen it.